So, friends, welcome to this lecture series on debates in Indian politics. We have been discussing module 1 of your syllabus about how to approach the Indian stage. In today's lecture is about Partha Chatterjee and his book The Nation and Its Fragments, Colonial and Post-Colonial Histories. Friends, we are not going to discuss the entire book in this lecture. Rather, we are going to read the chapter 2 of his book titled The Colonial State. And friends, overall, the book The Nation and Its Fragments, published in the year 1993, had a critical approach to the idea of, what is India. It was a book examining the national idea of India. And this idea, Partha Chatterjee was trying to explore into through various fragments of the nation, such as the Dalit, women, planned economy, and so on. So the book was basically a polemical book, not a highly footnoted, highly researched and highly empirical work. Rather, it is a polemical and analytical demonstration of India. A very, a book that contemplates the idea of India. And this book, in a sense, demolished the academic position that imperialism shaped Indian history, the modern Indian history. Imperialism shaped the modern Indian history, or the dominant academic position that, the dominant Indian academic position that India was a consumer of modernity rather than the producer of modernity. That India became modern not by our own efforts. Rather, we consumed modernity. India became modern just because we have inherited this modernity parameters from our connection with the West. And friends, this idea was a dominant idea in the Indian academia, in the Indian academic world, and Partha Chatterjee, by his own efforts, tried to demolish that idea by writing this book, that is The Nation and Its Fragments, Colonial and Post-Colonial Histories. And as I told you, it is a book that investigates the various fragments of the idea of India as a nation. As I told you, he investigates the Dalit position, the position of women, and several other aspects of what exactly constitutes the nation. And he also inquires about the state and the kind of state that we have inherited in India. What was the nature of that state in India, and how we have shaped the state in India. This idea he tried to investigate in this chapter 2 of his book. And friends, let us critically engage with the chapter, the colonial state. And friends, you see, Britain, a British colonial power, let us understand, the British colonial power and what it did to the native societies. Partha Chatterjee has begun his essay by looking at this question: the colonial power and what it did to the native society in terms of administration of the state. And of course, we know that Britain not only arrived in India, other parts of the world, the British Empire had dominant presence. For example, South Africa. Britain had a dominant presence. Or Australia. Britain had a very dominant presence. Or Canada. Britain had a very dominant presence. And in the societies of Africa, Asia, Britain had so many colonies. And you see, all these societies, say the Canadians, the Australians, the South Africans, had inherited a kind of modern state. And these states, of course, these states are not a state that was shaped by the native society alone. Before the the British Empire, before the British Empire entered into South African territory, it was basically a society of Aboriginal people, the native people. They had their own rules, they had their own life world, they had their own, organized collective life. That is same with, Australia or Canada, you say. And they all inherited a modern administrative state, a modern state with a police force, legal system, a bureaucracy, a rational bureaucracy. All these ideas, these societies inherited just because, they had a kind of connection with Britain in particular and Europe in general. And the same thing happened in India and elsewhere in Afro-Asian nations. The same thing happened. And it was not only Britain, France, Netherlands, the Italians, the Germans, they had their own presence, Spanish presence in different parts of the world. But Britain was a dominant, empire in the modern era. And you see, Britain colonized several, societies in Africa, Asia, and North America. And they all received independence too. And they had established or instituted their own idea of, what may be called a modern state. And we know that India also inherited our own state. And but, the point is that how Britain justified the colonization of native people. And you might remember the famous saying by, Joseph Rudyard Kipling, who was an English journalist, a short story writer, poet, and novelist, who had famously proposed a racist theory, which has been widely criticized. But, that was an underlying philosophy of, the colonizers who colonized the native society, that non-white people are uncivilized. Non-white people are not modern. Non-white people are still primitive. They don't have, mannerisms. They don't have, state-of-the-art technologies. They don't have a scientific temperament. And therefore, who is people with all these modern values? The colonizers always think that it is the white people, the people with the white color. And of course, the nature demanded the white people to dominate over non-white people, give them education, give them an idea of a modern state, give them the idea of a rational Weberian bureaucracy with impersonal rule that the mind, the bias, the prejudice of the officer in charge should not should not should not get influenced in his dealings with affairs of the state, that he should be an impartial officer. So this idea is unknown to non-white people, because when looking at the Indians, many British writers and British rulers even believed that Indians are a society. They don't know how to rule. They don't know how to respect authority. They don't know how to rule themselves, because when they see a king, they give unconditional obedience and allegiances to the ruler, because their mind is set that way. When you see a ruler, Indians show unwanted respect and unwanted obedience. That is in their blood. So many European writers had this notion about what India is. So that's why the famous British writer Rudyard Kipling's famous saying that non-white people are uncivilized and white people got a civilizing mission in non-white territories. And friends, the British colonialism, it was believed that was based on certain standard human social values. It is argued that Britain had a standard social values, and wherever Britain landed as an empire, wherever Britain had dominions or colonies, Britain always tried to keep that social standard, that modern value system, no matter whether native or the British. Wherever they landed, they always carried the baggage of that what may be called modern outlook. So they established criminal legal system. They established idea of impersonal bureaucracy in the certain native society. They had an impartial and independent judicial system. They had an idea of government by including the natives, because self-rule is a right. So the Britain was influenced by the writings of John Stuart Mill, of course. So British colonialism was founded on certain social values, such as justice, the notion of justice, the notion of natural liberty of man, and the notion of impersonal rule, government or rules. Rules should be impersonal. So these were the values upon which empire was built. And friends, keep in mind this idea that Britain had certain values, and these values the British Empire considered universal values. No matter where, you should implement social justice, the idea of justice, respect for human human dignity, and liberty, impersonal rule. These should be the values of empire wherever you go. And that rules and laws are based on rational notions of society and people. And friends, Partha Chatterjee, in his book The Nation and Its Fragments, explored into these questions, particularly in the chapter The Colonial State. He talks about the nature of colonial state, being instituted by Britain in India. And this chapter has 20 pages with 8 subsections. with 8 subsections, which we are going to read today. And the first subsection of this chapter on the colonial state begins with the colonial state as a modern regime of power. That was the subtitle. The colonial state as a modern regime of power. The colonial state as a modern regime of power. Let us understand what it is. Friends, Chatterjee has begun his chapter with a fundamental question. He is asking the reader, do we need to make a distinction between the colonial state and the modern state? Yeah, interesting question. You see, friends, you see what he is asking. He is asking you, the reader. Friends, he is asking you, the reader, that do we need to make a distinction between colonial state and the modern state? Interesting question. Whether the colonial state was different from the idea of a modern state, or is asking again to the reader, or colonial state, another form of state, modern state, another form of modern state, in which modern state is generalized across the globe. The colonial state, whether the colonial state, another form in which the idea or the notion of a modern state is generalized across the globe, Asia, Africa, North America. And here Chatterjee is introducing this idea, the colonial state as a modern regime of power. He calls this the colonial state as a modern regime of power. He never ventured into saying that the colonial state was a modern state. Rather, he is saying that modern regime of power. That was a regime of power. He is saying to the reader, if colonial state, if you understand colonial state as a specific form of modern state, you see, okay, you consider that colonial state is a specific form of modern state. Before the modern state began to take shape, you just consider it was another form of modern state. Then, as a student of political science, its emergence, the emergence of that colonial state and its flourishing, and how this flourished in the Indian society is of episodic interest. Because we consider all societies in a linear way. That there was ancient society, then the medieval society, then the modern society. And most writers and most societies believe that their past was good. The Chinese consider their past was great. The Indians consider their past was great. The Greco-Romans consider their past was great. The Iranians consider their past was great. The Persian Empire. All the societies in the world consider their past was great. But, their past was ruined in the medieval era by religion. And the societies went to a modern one. All the societies went into a modern form. And this march, friends, India too became modern. And how it became modern? Yes, we had colonial experiments, and through the colonial experiments, India became a modern society. That is the taken for granted narrative about India. And Chatterjee is challenging this grand narratives about the idea of a modern Indian nation. He's challenging this idea. And what is he saying? That is, if you consider the colonial state as a specific form of modern state, because the notion of liberty, equality, or a freedom, self-rule, or a rational Weberian bureaucracy, impersonal rule, all these ideas came to your society, just because you had a connection with the colonial masters, and they gave you all these ideas. Then, friends, of course, the notion of a colonial state is of episodic interest for a student of political science. You have to understand that, because how you had broke with your past is very important. Then how you had how you had broken with your past is very important, because you already had a past, you already had a society here, you already had a certain system here, and Britain intervened into that. You had the Mughals, and within the Mughals, you had the Humayun, the Shah Jahans, the Jahangir, the great Akbar, and you had so many ruling systems here. And before that, even Sangha Parivar literature will tell you that you had great kings, emperors, dynasties, kingdoms. They were all great, and they founded so many what may be called a golden era in Indian history. That's what the right-wing historiography will tell you, that the Porus, who challenged the great Alexander, the Chandragupta Maurya, Kanishka, Ashoka, you were there, it was the golden era of Indian history. Universities. And Britain came to your society, intervened, and had broken all these systems, and you had lost the touch with your past. And Chatterjee is questioning these grand narratives about the idea of a modern state in India. And Chatterjee is telling the reader, friends, telling the reader that the colonial form of the modern state, becomes incidental to the historical narrative of modernity. The colonial form of the modern state, that modern state came in India through the colonial state. Universities came to your society just because you had a connection with a colonial state. Modern education came to your society just because you had a connection with a colonial state. The notion of modern science came to your society just because you had a connection with a colonial state. And friends, the colonial form of the modern state becomes incidental to the historical narrative of modernity. That is just incidental then, because ancient society, the medieval society, and the modern society, it is a linear development. And in this linear development, you had transitioned from a golden era of ancient history and a ruined era of medieval history and a grand, colossal, towering time of modern era, in which a modern state was instituted in your society. And in this process, friends, colonial state was just incidental. That happened for a short period of time. Clear? That happened for a short period of time. That was incidental in the historical narratives about what is modernity. Modernity happened in the modern era. In the medieval era, men were not rational. They were irrational, superstitious. And friends, this notion is quite commonplace in the Indian academia. Because, people think modernity is an ongoing project. That, modernity is there in every society. The notion of a modern worldview, scientific worldview, views about nature, views about, what man is, what man's social world is. These are not instant, development in your society. Rather, all these, there in the all these existed in your society right from the ancient world. And modernity from time to time, evolved. And this is a what may be called a taken for granted idea about all the societies. And this is so, this so happened again in India too. But Chatterjee had a different take on this, saying, friends, he's saying, the colonial state was also more than just about colonial rule. It was more than just about a colonial rule. You just see, the colonial state instituted in India a vast infrastructure of institutions, military, communication projects, transportation projects. These are all undertaken by the colonial rule. They founded universities, they founded railway, they founded modern communication infrastructure, roads, bridges, monumental structures. And the colonial rule, friends, left a permanent mark in India. It left a permanent mark in India. And 100 years later, 1,000 years later, or 10,000 years later, friends, when you look back, your history, how your ancestors lived in this part of the world, Chatterjee is saying, you can still feel that, there are traces of a colonial rule, because Britain has intervened in the soul of India. In the soul of India. That's why he's telling to his reader that colonial presence left a permanent mark in the very notion of India. And he's not just making a polemical statement, he's referring to the kind of infrastructure projects that Britain had undertaken in India, including railway, road construction, and other projects. And he's trying to make a Foucauldian reading of Indian history, colonial power in India, a Foucault. He's using Foucault and trying to understand what the colonial power, how it looked like. And Chatterjee is saying, friends, he's telling to his reader that, you see, modern regime of power in India produces and facilitates rather than prohibits its citizen. Modern regime of power in India that happened through a colonial state which produces and facilitates the citizen rather than prohibits the citizen. And friends, of course, both the British historians as well as the nationalist Indian historians, you might remember D.D. Kosambi, who wrote an Indian version of Indian history, including the nationalist historians and the British historians. All of them agree the fact that, that the colonial mission in India created institutions, modern institutions. And this is a narrative by the British historians. And you might remember James Mill, who created an Indian history by saying that ancient India, Hindu India, Muslim India, and modern India ruled by Christians. This sort of what may be called a communal history as written by James Mill. And you see, the British writers always argued that British historians argued that in India, modern institutions was created by colonial state. And nationalist Indian historians agreed that. And for them, India was superstitious, a society, primitive society, uncivilized society for the nationalist Indian historians. And our society has been shaped by the colonial state. And friends, Chatterjee is going to tell you a very important principle here. He uses this principle as an analytical category to expose the hollow argument. What is the hollow argument? We can understand this by using his principle, which he used to understand the idea of a modern nation in India. What is that principle? That principle is called the rule of colonial difference. The rule of colonial difference. And friends, let us understand what is this idea called the rule of colonial difference. Friends, in 1919, Montagu-Chelmsford reforms were submitted. And Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in 1919 a scheme of granting India a measure of responsible government was introduced. A responsible idea of a responsible government. A government that is responsible to the natives. Because India is theirs. So the Britain should be responsible to the natives also. This idea, this notion was incorporated in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. But friends, Chatterjee is introducing the notion of rule of colonial difference with respect to the earlier argument that India became modern just because of our connection with the colonial state. And the colonial state had a civilizing mission. And it had broke up with our past institutions. And our past has been broken, and we had a new history by colonial state. And see, Chatterjee is intervening into that controversial argument and trying to propose something new. You see, he's saying about rule of colonial difference, and for proposing that, he's looking at Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in 1919. What is that? That a responsible government was introduced. But friends, the idea of a responsible government in India by the British was contested at that time. Because for the British historians, British rulers, British administrators, Indian society was not prepared for impersonal governance. Indian society was not prepared for impersonal governance. Because caste is still dominating in India, and the notion of caste in India do not go hand in hand with the notion of a Weberian impersonal bureaucracy. See, friends, caste has nothing to do with the Weberian bureaucracy, because Weberian bureaucracy is merit-based, that is rational, that is neutral, that is impersonal. It has nothing to do with the people's biases, prejudices, and their loyalties, their notion of religion, or their atheism, or their theism, or their what may be called their critique of God. But friends, Britain believed idea of a responsible government is not that possible, because in India caste is still dominating, and the notion of a caste will not find parallel with the idea of impersonal governance, because notion of caste will always interfere in the idea of governance. Caste is incompatible with democracy. Caste is incompatible with democracy. And if you experiment in responsible government in India, there were sayings in the British circle that this experiment will be counterproductive to the British mission in India. Such a policy of responsible government will be a total collateral damage to the British project in India, because India's on primitive notions about caste will become a stumbling block to impersonal governance. And not only that, such a policy makes no practical or theoretical sense. And so, responsible government cannot be introduced in India. So, a modern regime of power, which with this regime of power has regulating functions, disciplining function, or normalizing principles. A normalizing principle, it can be justified that a modern regime of power, not a colonial state, rather a modern regime of power, a state by Britain in India, which exercises power only, not the notion of colonial state with the impersonal bureaucracy, with impersonal governance, with the idea of justice, liberty, modern notions. That cannot be that possible in India, because Indian society is very, very different. In such a scenario, let us have a modern regime of power with a regulating function, disciplining function, or normalizing functions. And this is possible because it makes power effective in India. It makes power productive in India. And it also makes power humane in India. So, Chatterjee substantiates this argument that a colonial state in India existed through a rule of colonial difference. He substantiated this idea by referring to three important variables. One is race, second is public opinion, race and bureaucracy, race and public opinion, language and freedom of speech. With these three variables, he was challenging the dominant notion that prevailed in the Indian academia, that India became modern through a linear process of from ancient to the medieval, from the medieval to the modern. No, Chatterjee challenged this by proposing the idea of the rule of colonial difference. And he is explaining this to his reader. Let us see what he has to say about race and rational bureaucracy. Revolt of 1857 happened, and it forced the colonial state to reveal its true form as a modern regime of power. Revolt of 1857 forced the colonial state in India to reveal its true form as a modern regime of power. The revolt was followed by hard conservatism that criticized liberal evangelism in Britain. And also advocated leaving the immoral native customs in India alone. Right? You leave that immoral customs in India alone and do not interfere with that. Revolt of 1857, had created a public opinion in British circle that you should not interfere with the native immoral cultures. This reaction clearly revealed that revealed the factor that rulers and the ruled should be separated in India. Rulers and the ruled should be separated in India. And this is the rule of colonial difference. This is the rule of colonial difference. And the rule of colonial difference was most visible through the notion of race. Racial differences become more entrenched. Sorry. Even as the administration was being rationalized. Of course, in India, you will have a colonial state which is impersonal, which is not, subjected to the prejudices and beliefs and other kinds of loyalties of the people in power. Of course, it is a rational Weberian bureaucracy. But even though the administration in India, British Raj in India was rationalized, racial differences are still there. So there was an apparent paradox in the Indian administration of the colonial state. On the one side, there was racial discrimination being practiced by the colonial state, that you should not interfere in the immoral native customs. You should not interfere in the immoral native customs. Let it go its own way. But at the same time, Britain also practiced what may be called merit-based rationalization of administration. Merit-based rationalization of administration. Here we understand that Britain come here not to civilize you, friends. Chatterjee's most striking argument comes here. Britain came here not to civilize you, but to finish its colonial project. And if Britain wants to fulfill it, it is possible only through preservation of that colonial difference. So the Ilbert Bill 1883 controversy. This brought the issue of whether bureaucratic rationalization should be allowed to transgress racial division. Ilbert Bill controversy raised a question whether bureaucratic rationalization should be allowed to transgress racial divisions. So there were quite clear examples of racial divisions in India. For example, Indian judicial officers, which comprise both the natives as well as the Europeans or the British people in the judiciary. But friends, you know that Indian judges were not allowed to hear British citizens. But British judges were allowed to hear the Indian citizen as well as the British citizens. And Lord Ripon, who introduced the bill, aimed at straightening out these regulations. But a veritable storm broke out. There were strong objections. This forced the Viceroy to pass the bill wholly emasculated form. So this is one example of racial discrimination being practiced by the colonial state, British colonial state, because that discriminated between the native population and the British population. So Britain had not that, civilizing mission, because it did not want to interfere in the local custom, which they call immoral. And second, race and public opinion. Friends, you see, Ilbert Bill controversy. Ilbert Bill also illuminated the relationship between state and civil society. And Chatterjee invites the readers to some issues in Calcutta, colonial Calcutta. What happened there? In colonial Calcutta, civil society was composed only of Europeans, residents. You see, the voices of civil society in colonial Calcutta means the voices of the British people, not the native Calcutta citizens. So the curious state-civil society relationship were revealed in an interesting way by Nil Darpan affair. Nil Darpan affair. Chatterjee quotes the Nil Darpan affair. That was also a controversy. What was that? Nil Darpan was a translation of a Bengali play. Translation of a Bengali play. Nil Darpan. That is the Indigo Mirror. The Indigo Mirror. It was written by Deenbandhu Mitra. Deenbandhu Mitra, which spoke of the indigo question. That that Bengali play spoke of what may be called the indigo question from the perspective of the native Indians, not from the perspective of the British indigo cultivators, right? And Nil Darpan was in a sense critical of the indigo cultivation by Britishers in India. And John Peter Grant, the then Calcutta governor, who had taken efforts to translate Nil Darpan or the Indigo Mirror into English language. And friends, what happened? You know what happened? Just because the governor took initiatives to translate this Nil Darpan, which was critical of British indigo cultivation, the governor was charged with circulating a foul and malicious libel against the British. You see, the translator, the Nil Darpan was translated by James Long, an Irish missionary. James Long, he was convicted of libel and sentenced. He was sentenced just for translating that play, Bengali play. The governor was reprimanded, and this Seton Kar, C-T-O-N, Seton Kar, K-A-R-R, Seton Kar, the secretary to the government of Bengal, the then secretary to the government of Bengal, who arranged this translation, was dismissed from service. Chatterjee quotes from historical archival resources. And friends, what really was on trial? See, friends, Deenbandhu Mitra, who wrote that play, was not subjected to any kind of trial. And who actually was trialed? It was trial, for the trial happened for the governor, the secretary, and the person who translated that. And what is the issue at stake? Friends, it's very clear. Chatterjee was very, very much clear about what he was saying. He was saying that, friends, it was not the play or its author, and the author was not at all named in the controversy. The target was actually the government, which had dared to libel against the public opinion. And who constituted the public opinion in colonial India? In colonial India, public opinion should be formed not by the native Indians. Public opinion should be formed by the British people in India. And here what happened? The Bengali play Nil Darpan created a public opinion which was against Britain. That is not acceptable to the British Empire. That's why all these people were trialed and sentenced and somebody dismissed. So, public opinion. And the colonial state considered public opinion is the opinion of not the native Indians, but the British people. So there is a rule of colonial difference, Chatterjee argues. And third point, friends, language and freedom of speech. You freedom of speech. You just take into consideration the question of public opinion. In 1870s, some legal means were initiated to control seditious writings in India. that those who write against British Empire will be charged with sedition and will be sentenced. And you are not supposed to write in vernacular language against the Britain. And writings in vernacular press were prohibited, while in English papers it is still possible. That is, despite this differentiation between the English and vernacular press, the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, with stringent provisions, tried to control native press. However, this Vernacular Press Act was repealed 4 years later, because the reason was that native Indians started to write in English. You can prevent us from writing in vernacular press, but we will write in English. So that's why this Vernacular Press Act was repealed. But the point is that Britain was very much discriminating native language and the British language, which gave more priority to the British language. And so, friends, Chatterjee is looking at another subheading: nationalism and colonial difference. Friends, you see, Chatterjee is telling you, the reader, you see, nationalism claimed sovereignty. Nationalism, India's national movement claimed sovereignty over the inner spiritual domain of Indian nation. Inner spiritual domain. What is that inner spiritual domain? That is, your language is your inner spiritual domain. Your religion is your inner spiritual domain. Your civil relations, how you engage with other citizens in your society, is your inner spiritual domain. And these domains are yours. It should not be clubbed with the European modern worldview. You have your own world, your social systems. And nationalist movement reclaimed the sovereignty of India over that domain. India has unique culture, unique language, unique science, unique scientific temperament, scientific outlook, worldview. These are all Indian and unique to India, and we should claim sovereignty over that question. And that was achieved by the nationalist movement in India. But Chatterjee is saying you, the reader, but there was an essential difference. What is that? That is, at the same time, nationalist movements tried to remove the mark of differences between Britain and India in the outer domains like administration, state, and law. See, in the inner domain, nationalist movement claimed for sovereignty. That, in his Garbagar debate, Chatterjee is criticizing this, double stand of Indian nationalist movement, that you have invited reforms and everything in your society till the courtyard of your house. You didn't invite reforms inside your home. Inside your home, you are still that pre-modern, that in your relationship with your husband and wife, in your relationship with siblings or brother and sister, parents and children, there is no modern outlook. You are still pre-modern. Your value system inside the home is not touched by the nationalist movement. That is left untouched. Where you claim that you have a sovereignty. And at the same time, this nationalist movement on the other side began to wipe out all the differences between Europe and India in terms of law. In terms of law, the European law should be here. In terms of bureaucracy, the same bureaucracy should be here. In terms of state and its institution, the same should be implemented here. But what of society? And society, no, you should not modernize society in India. No, you should not do that. You should not implement a kind of modern society that existed in Europe in India. You should not bring that modern society to India. Indian society is different, so you should not interfere in that. That was the take of the nationalist movement, and Chatterjee was so much critical of this double standards, and that's why he tried to interrogate these issues by his rule of colonial difference. So nationalism, and there were colonial difference in terms of nationalist movement, and Chatterjee is arguing that the revisionist argument of British colonial history challenged the assumption that the revisionist argument of British colonial history challenged the assumption that colonial rule represented a significant break. Colonial rule represented a significant break, and argues that colonial regime was a continuation of the indigenous regimes. Colonial regime was a continuation of the indigenous regime. That, as I told you, you had a past, you had an ancient India, you had a medieval India, and you had a modern India. And in modern India, Britain came here, colonialism came here. But revisionist argument of British history, colonial history, argues that the kind of colonial state you had here was somehow indigenous also. Because colonial state didn't remove the indigenous element in the colonial Indian states. Still there are indigenous elements in the colonial Indian states. This was an argument put forth by the revisionist British colonial historians. And Barton Stein, Chatterjee is referring to Barton Stein, a colonial British historian who was a revisionist. Barton Stein says the period between 1750, 100 years, it was a period of transition. The early colonial rule slowly centralized military power. Just like the Indian predecessors did, Akbar did, Shah Jahan did, or the Delhi Sultanate did, or before that, Chandragupta Maurya did, or Ashoka did, Kanishka did, a centralized military power. But later, Barton Stein argued that colonial state also imposed a regime based on impersonality, which according to Barton Stein was a marked discontinuity from the past. Because in the past, there was a notion of sense of what may be called impersonal bureaucracy or impersonal administration in India. That was argument by Barton Stein. And Frank Perlin, another colonial British historian, a revisionist. This argument, he put forth the idea that the centralizing tendency characterized largely the early colonial stage. The early colonial stage characterized a centralizing tendency. He adds that the early colonial rule largely extinguished intermediary pockets of power in India. Which come from pre-colonial indigenous governments. But Chatterjee, looking at all these writers, put forth something different. In his next subheading, that is colonial difference as a post-colonial difference. Colonial difference as a post-colonial difference. What is that? With this, I will wind up this, reading. Historical theory makes a violent intrusion and excess of colonialism. Historical theory makes violent intrusion and excess of colonialism, which appears to be an innate property of indigenous history. And looking at Washbrook, another colonial British Indian historian, Washbrook asserts that the similarity between Indian and European economic arrangements, the similarity between European and Indian economic arrangements adopted a means of providing authenticity to Indian history. So, the assertion of difference by our predecessors, put colonialism at odds with a society incapable of capitalism and modern government, and thus necessitating colonial intervention and education. Clear? The assertion of difference by predecessors put colonialism at odds with a society incapable of capitalism. That Indian society was incapable of capitalism and Indian society was incapable of modern government. This necessitated colonial intervention and education. But Washbrook has erased colonialism out of existence, for it becomes an interlude. Colonialism was an interlude for Washbrook, a phase in the historical development of India. Colonialism was basically an interlude in the historical development of India. The further implication is that if India is backward today, friends, it is due to the limitations of its own indigenous history. If you are still indigenous, if you are still pre-modern, if you still are backward, friends, it is not because of Britain came here. It is not because British colonialism came here. It is because you have now an indigenous history of your own. And your failure is because it's your own weakness. It's because of your own weakness. So friends, this is one interesting argument put forth by Partha Chatterjee in his chapter, The Colonial State, in the book, The Nation and Its Fragments. And friends, now the floor is open for discussion. You can have questions.